Thanks everyone for coming to the seminar today. We have a presentation by Professor Kingwell on the carbon challenge for WA. Most of you know Professor Kingwell, a long-time member of the school and also well known outside, and also a distinguished fellow of the Australian Ag and Resource Economic Society. So I am not going to say more, so I will pass on the forum to Russ. Thanks, Russ.
Thanks, Takulti. So the topic today is an examination of the carbon neutral challenge facing Western Australian agriculture in the face of forecast adverse climate change. So this is the situation that we've just come through, the impact of COVID with its local and global impacts, and we're about to go into another phase where internationally and locally we're going to need to respond to the challenge of climate change, and in particular the need to reduce emissions, including the emissions from agriculture. When it comes to Australian greenhouse gas emissions, we're only about 25 million people, and yet our emissions are greater than a country like the United Kingdom that has many more people than we do. The other point to make in this big picture is that it is possible to have some very adverse events, and I cite the bushfires in Eastern Australia at the end of 2019, and just the emissions from that single event were equal to the entire annual emissions of Australia in 2018. When it comes to Western Australian greenhouse gas emissions, this is a chart that shows the trajectory of those emissions since 1990. That's the upper squiggly blue line. And you'll notice that Western Australian emissions are not on a downward trajectory. They are in fact escalating. So we are just adding to the global stocks of CO2, particularly through our energy sector. However, the focus of today's talk is not on the entirety of Western Australia. It's a sole focus on the agricultural sector within the West Australian economy. And when it comes to agriculture, there is a better newsworthy story in as much as emissions from Western Australian agriculture, and I'm going to focus on emissions from the agricultural region of Western Australia because that's by far the main source of the gross value of agricultural production in Western Australia. This is a region that stretches from Geraldton on our north coast down to the Esperance region on our south coast. So it's a very large southwest corner of Western Australia where the bulk of agricultural activity takes place. And the greenhouse gas emissions from that region are displaying a downward trajectory. And most of the emissions that come from that region are the fairly large blue-coloured segment of each column stack, and they are enteric emissions. That means they are emissions that principally come from cattle and sheep. The biology of cattle and sheep production is such that when they engage in growth, they consume grains and feeds, and those feeds get passed through their rumen and become in part an output of methane gas that is mostly belched out rather than farted out, and it's those methane emissions that are the enteric emissions that are the principal source of greenhouse gas emissions in Western Australian agriculture. This is a chart that looks at the spatial change in those emissions from 1990 to 2015, and you'll see the only shires in which increases have occurred are coloured light blue. So in almost every shire, there has been a decline in emissions, and in some of the shires, emissions have declined across that 25-year period by more than 50%. They're the grey coloured shires, and they're principally in the north and the east of the agricultural region. And the reason why the emissions reductions have been so substantial in those shires is principally due to the exodus of sheep in those agricultural landscapes, with farming systems shifting strongly towards more crop dominant farming systems. So where the bulk of agricultural emissions are occurring in the agricultural region of Western Australia are principally in the southern shires. They're the dark blue coloured shires. And why are emissions so prevalent and dominant in those parts of the landscape? Well, for two reasons. One is that sheep production continues and cattle production continues to be a key feature of farming systems in those shires. Also, because these regions tend to receive higher rainfall and have longer growing seasons, it's often the case that farmers have switched into a crop like canola. So canola features more strongly in farming systems in these southern areas, and canola is a crop that requires a higher level of emission producing inputs, particularly urea fertilisers. Also, just in general, the fact that these shires receive higher rainfall means they can accommodate higher levels of inputs, and those higher level of inputs are associated with higher emissions. The positive news is that 76% of all those shires meet with Kyoto Protocol obligations, and over half of the shires are currently on track to satisfy Paris Agreement targets. But the principal cause of the emissions reduction has been a substantial reduction in Western Australia's sheep population. It's gone from over 36 million back in 1990 to currently be around 14 million. So that's a 62% reduction in sheep numbers. That's part of the reason why you pay such high prices for lamb at the supermarket, because there's been a reduction in supply. Associated with the historical reduction in emissions since 1990 are, in effect, a new set of targets. Many government and industry bodies have made statements both locally and nationally that they are committed to often what is called net zero emissions by 2050. And these are emission reduction targets that apply to every sector, including agriculture. That means Western Australian agriculture does face additional challenge, because in the last 30 years, we've reduced emissions by around 26% without really trying to reduce emissions. The reduction in emissions has really been triggered by farmers responding to technology and market signals. However, in the next 30 years, the challenge is that WA agriculture needs to reduce or offset its remaining 74% of emissions. So what was achieved in the last 30 years is going to be, in some ways, a substantially greater challenge over the next 30 years. That said, there are other voices, and this is a table from the Climate Council, just indicating that of all the sectors that are in need of reducing their emissions, agriculture is one sector where the common view is that further reduction in its emissions is going to be a difficult task. If you look at Australia, the history of Australian agriculture has been a steady decline in the agricultural area. It's due to factors such as urbanisation, reforestation, and yet our agricultural production has continued to increase, as has our export prowess. So in many ways, the agricultural sector traditionally has been underpinned by increased levels of production, and that's been attributable to a range of factors, including increased application of inputs. However, that strategy of increased application of inputs is associated with an uplift in emissions. If you look at that increase in production, yes, it's mostly attributable not to an increase in the area allocated to agricultural activity, but it's mostly been attributable to yield improvement. In the case of grains, for example, over the last 15 years, there's been very little increase in crop areas. Before that, there was a strong shift out of sheep production, with pasture areas declining and accommodating greater areas of cropping. That's been less true in the last 15 years, and yet despite that maintained availability of a set stock of land, grain yields across all crop types have continued to increase. So the challenge to become carbon neutral when you're on a rising plane of production underpinned by yield increases has to be placed against the backdrop of what is the natural environment under which farmers are going to attempt to increase yields further in order to enhance their production. These are some charts based on climate modelling from DPIRD colleagues, and what it shows on the left is historical patterns of rainfall in the agricultural region versus what is anticipated to be the future pattern of growing season rainfall. So this is rainfall between April to October, and it's fairly clear, and I must admit this is a fairly extreme climate view based on continued high levels of global emissions, but nonetheless it is a backdrop that farm businesses need to plan against. That is, to plan against the fact that they may in future years have less access to growing season rainfall than their fathers and grandfathers did. Similarly, the other key part of the challenge is not only a prospective decline in growing season rainfall, but also the fact that in the grain filling period, in the period of the flush of pastures to support animal production, there is the prospect of an increasing frequency of very hot days, which become a challenge to spring pasture production that triggers early senescence. It also creates difficulties for grain filling and grain quality. And you'll see that particularly in the north and eastern areas of the agricultural region, there are some very adverse conditions in prospect. So what are farmers' options to reduce their emissions? Well, they can obviously try and switch into greater energy efficiency. They can continue to switch away from animal production. They can introduce anti-methanogenic shrubs and pastures. They can switch away from extensive animal production with more intensive animal production, drawing on more grain feeding with the addition of anti-methanogenic feed supplements. You can also create emission offsets on your least profitable farmland. So this is planting trees and shrubs that will store the emissions that other parts of your farm business produce. You can buy offsets elsewhere. You can seek carbon neutral premiums that will pay for the higher cost of technologies that are less emissions intensive. You can demand from government and industry greater investments in low emission inputs and technologies, and through breeding you can hope to create some lower emission animals. So they're some of the portfolio of activities that future farm businesses are likely to consider. The other story to bear in mind is that consumers will be continuously applying pressure not only on farm businesses but on other aspects of the farm supply chains, so that you get reduced emissions at the farm level and also in supply chains. When it comes to bread consumption, you'll see that there's a lot of emissions in the production of bread that don't actually come from the farm, but come from off the farm, whereas the reverse is true for meat. Most of the emissions associated with consumers' consumption of fresh meat actually come from the farm. So when it comes to a product like meat, there will be a very strong focus on the farm sector. When it comes to processed grain-based products, there will be a less strong focus on the farm sector. What are some of the innovations and practices that might help reduce emissions? Well, there's the use of non-polluting, that is non-greenhouse gas emission fuel sources, a greater use of electric vehicles where the electricity is generated by renewable sources. So this is utilities, cars, very lightweight trucks. When it comes to heavy machinery, however, there'll be the likelihood of other power sources such as hydrogen fuel tractors and hydrogen powered trucks. Then there's innovations, and here's an example of one currently being used in the European Union. It's a mask that is fitted to dairy cows, and it captures the methane that is breathed out by those cows, and chemicals in that mask convert that methane and capture it so that it doesn't escape into the atmosphere, and that's highly effective. So you don't disturb the biology of the animal, but you deal with its emissions. So just a bit of technical background here. When cattle and sheep digest feed, about 2 to 10% of the feed energy is lost in the form of methane. There's a lot of research underway that shows that by quite a range of different treatments, it is possible to reduce the in situ methane energy loss of grazing animals by more than 15%. People like Richard Eckard at the University of Melbourne, in several of his papers, outline some of those technologies that are either currently in early stages of adoption or are under development. So there are ways of dealing with emissions from the primary source of agricultural emissions, that is, emissions from cattle and sheep. Then there's the bigger picture of what happens if technologies don't become available or become too expensive to allow farm businesses to be carbon neutral solely through embracing technologies. So if those farm businesses have to start investing in abating those emissions that are just too difficult or too expensive to further reduce, then what would happen? And so what I'm going to talk about now is the situation whereby the West Australian agricultural region becomes reliant on reforestation to abate the remainder of its emissions. Now, to date, most of the abatement options are outside agricultural regions, in pastoral regions, in tropical regions, either through changes in savanna burning or alterations to stocking rates in pastoral regions where you get vegetative thickening and storing of more carbon in the landscapes. In agriculture, there are far fewer abatement options that are profitably being adopted. One of the tried and true and most commonly applied forms of abatement in agricultural regions to date has been reforestation. And typically reforestation is occurring on those parts of farm landscapes that are less suited or less profitable when it comes to farm production. So we plant the trees and gradually the trees grow and the CO2 is stored in the shoots and roots of those trees. And so you get the CO2 being stored in a form shown in the chart here. And of course, when you invest in reforestation, there's a whole suite of costs, both setup and annual and monitoring costs that are associated with that. The main cost, however, is usually the opportunity cost of switching land out of agriculture into forestry. And there's other costs, and I won't go into that. So when you look at reforestation on farmland and figure out, how much does it actually cost you to generate a tonne of abatement, you end up with a spatial map like this, where the parts of the region where you can, at less cost, provide abatement services tend to be, again, in those southerly shires where they receive greater rainfall, they have longer growing seasons, so they are more conducive to growing biomass in the form of trees. So they can, at lower cost relative to, say, areas in the north of the state where trees grow very slowly, where they receive less rainfall, and they therefore are a more expensive source of abatement. And when you plot all those 80 shires to form a marginal cost of abatement, you get a sigmoidal curve like this, and that's the current level of emissions that occur annually in the agricultural region. However, when you have a look at the market price of what are known as Australian carbon credit units, what you find is that over the last 8 years, this has been the trajectory of the value of carbon credits in the marketplace. So about twice a year for the last 8 years has been auctions for the supply of abatement services across Australia. And these are the auction prices that have been generated. And you'll notice that they are far less than the cost of providing those carbon abatement opportunities in the West Australian agricultural region. And that's why on that map I showed you earlier that most of the abatement is coming from the tropical and pastoral areas. It's not coming from the agricultural areas because the agricultural land is so valuable for its use in agriculture that using it to grow trees for offsets is far less lucrative. And when it comes to just looking at the grains industry in Western Australia, you'll see that its task to become carbon neutral is far less than the task for the entire agricultural region, because the difference between the current emissions and the emissions just coming from grains is really due to the fact that livestock are the predominant source of emissions in the region. What I've done, and there's a few papers I've published that look at this, through this lens of mathematical modelling, I've tried to figure out if the region had to become carbon neutral, which shires and to what degree would land be switched out of farming to provide least cost abatement through reforestation. And in this model, I'm able to capture things like the fact that it's probably only going to be politically feasible to have portions of each shire switched out of farming into abatement. It just won't be politically palatable to allow entire shires to be captured for offset activity. So I won't go into that. But what I've done with this model is that I've applied it to 48 scenarios. So I've looked forward, because remember, by 2050 we're meant to be carbon neutral, and I've looked at 3 levels of emission reductions where I'm saying that I reckon there's going to be new technologies that will allow farmers to reduce to some degree their level of on-farm emissions. So I've looked at 3 levels of emission reductions. So if you like, these are 3 targets that must be met in order for the region to be carbon neutral. But then I've factored in the fact that if we're going to have adverse climate change, then what will also happen is that tree growth will be subdued, because tree growth is mostly a function of annual rainfall. And if we're going to have less rainfall, trees are going to grow less well, less quickly, and therefore they're going to store less CO2 emissions. And that has implications for the value of land when it gets switched into reforestation. And then I've looked at 2 types of reforestation projects. There's the gold standard 100-year projects, and then there are 25-year projects that have in recent years become allowable by the federal government. So previously you couldn't plant trees for 25 years and generate ACCUs, whereas now you can. And if you remember that sigmoidal pattern of trees, most trees reach maturity around about 40 years. So with a 100-year project, you had those trees sitting in the landscape for about 60 years, not adding much carbon. The 25-year option is much better because you're capturing much more of the potential final growth of yield. And then I've looked at 2 levels of what's known as the risk of reversal buffer. When you have reforested land, there's 5% of the carbon stored in those trees that has to be set aside for what's called a risk of reversal buffer. This is to deal with the fact that you're going to have tree death, you're going to have wildfires that are going to cause some of those stored carbons to be returned to the atmosphere in an unanticipated way. So I've looked at what happens if, under more adverse climate change and a greater frequency of bushfires, the risk of reversal buffer is increased from 5% to 7.5%. And then I've looked at 2 levels of political constraint on the proportion of farmland in any shire that can be switched into reforestation. I've looked at 15% and 25% of the potential farmland in each shire legally being available to be switched out of farming, that is traditional farming, into reforestation. So having done all that modelling, what have I found? Well, no surprise here that in scenarios where there are cost-effective technologies that offer large reductions in emissions, then the cost of achieving carbon neutrality is much reduced. You know, that's almost a truism. The other unsurprising finding is that the 25-year plantation option is far more cost-effective in providing carbon neutrality than the 100-year plantation option. The adverse impacts of climate change, again, no surprise here, reduces the effectiveness of reforestation, and it does increase the cost of abatement. The fourth key finding is that if you decrease the proportion of farmland in any shire that can be converted, then that will increase the cost of achieving carbon neutrality, because effectively it means that in shires that could be low-cost sources of abatement, you actually reduce the access to those shires whenever you have introduced prohibitions on the switching of more of that farmland out of farming into reforestation. And again, consistent with what I've said earlier, the more cost-effective shires that end up being most targeted for reforestation are the southerly shires. So just to go through some of those 48 scenarios, I've just selected a few. So if you look at scenario 7, this is where I've said that the region's emission levels are going to be able to decline by 25%, but tree growth is going to decline due to adverse climate change by 15%, that farmers or investors are going to embrace the 100-year reforestation projects. There's going to be a 7.5% risk of reversal buffer and a 15% limit on land use change. So if they're the parameters of that scenario, then the region's annual emissions are about 5.6 million metric tonnes of CO2 equivalents. The reforestation area has to be about 1.5 million hectares. So that's land that is switched out of farming into forestry. That is equivalent to about a 9.5% share of the region's farmland being switched out of farming into reforestation. And over half of all shires contribute to that reforestation. And the annual cost of providing that carbon neutrality is $255 million. And let's have a look at another one. Let's have a look at the next one, where scenario 15, you get emission levels being declined again by 25%, same 15% decline in tree growth, but you're looking at 25-year projects rather than 100-year projects, the same risk of reversal buffer and limit on land use change. And you'll see that there's a marked reduction in the annual cost, and that's because those 25-year reforestation projects are much more cost effective in providing the abatement. Then what happens if technologies are even more skilled at being able to cost effectively reduce agricultural emissions? So let's say emissions are able to decline by 50%, and there's only a 10% decline in tree growth, and we look at 25-year projects with the risk of reversal buffer being unchanged and a very conservative limit on land use change being set at 15%. Well, in that case, the annual cost goes down even further to only 86 million a year, and emissions go down from the 5.6 million metric tonnes to about 3.7 million metric tonnes. So if science and technologists can deliver the emission reducing technologies, then there's a reduced need for reforestation, and therefore the cost of becoming carbon neutral is far less. And if you have a look at the two scenarios, the scenario 15, so let's just go back. So scenario 15 was a 25% decline in emissions. The scenario 25 was a 50% decline in emissions. So what we're looking at here is the difference in the efficacy of technologies that reduce farm emissions. So in the scenario where we're only reducing emissions in the region by 25% through technological improvement, then you need many more shires to participate in the provision of reforestation services. Whereas if technologists are able to deliver a 50% reduction in emissions, then many fewer shires need to be targeted to provide the reforestation offsets. And what you find here is, again, just a chart that just shows across all shires, it's still those southern shires under climate change where you're able to provide lower cost sequestration services. Okay, in the interest of time, I won't go into these other scenarios, but what I'll do is just talk about some of the important caveats and implications of the findings. What I haven't done in the analysis is that I haven't examined cheaper ways of reducing or offsetting emissions, such as farmers investing in offsets in pastoral areas or non-agricultural areas. I've also assumed that farmland prices are not going to be impacted by reforestation. That is, the best use of land in that region will remain land used for agriculture, and that therefore it's agricultural activity that is predominantly going to be setting the value of farmland prices. I also haven't considered if consumers are going to be willing to pay premiums for carbon neutral products, and I haven't included the fact that governments may be willing to support reforestation investments by providing additional payments for not only the abatement that those reforestation stands provide, but for the environmental services additional to carbon abatement that those stands provide. And I haven't considered what might be the impacts on different farm enterprises. So within each shire, there's obviously going to be another set of spatial impacts dependent on the enterprise mix of farms within that shire. The implications are that WA agriculture is very profitable, and that's shown in recent strong upward movements in the prices of farmland. Now, we think we're doing well in our metropolitan suburbs when we get an annual increase of real estate prices of 5 to 10%. Well, in the last few years, if you take 2019, the median price farmland in WA increased by a whopping 28%. So farmland is very valuable. Investing in methane, reducing innovations is probably a more cost-effective pathway than using farmland as reforestation opportunities. The carbon price, as we have observed it over the last 7 years, that carbon price, even the current carbon price, needs to at least double before most farmers are going to see any financial incentive to diversify to include reforestation as a viable additional economic activity. Obviously, if governments and consumers come to the party, that's going to increase the incentive eventually. The other issue is that the cost of farmers, particularly grain farmers, becoming carbon neutral is in fact not that high, particularly if emission reducing technologies become available. And there are, for grain farmers, things like special coatings on urea fertilisers that reduce the nitrous oxide emissions from those fertilisers. And obviously some of the emissions associated with farm machinery can be reduced if they switch to renewable fuels. Very quickly, some other analyses that I've done where I've said, well, hold on, what happens if the carbon credit price suddenly starts to escalate, and as other sectors feel the pinch of the need to become carbon neutral and start looking for abatement opportunities and start paying high prices for farmland to reforest. And that ends up driving up the ACCU price. So that's a series of price trajectories that I've examined and what the impact of those trajectories might mean. And what I've found is that the price plateau of those ACCU prices, and by the price plateau, I mean, if you look at these trajectories, you'll see that each of them has a plateau at which the prices reach their maximum, and often they then start trending downwards after that. But if you look at the prices of those different plateaus, then the ACCU plateau price that tends to trigger reforestation, that is, this is the price at which farmers willingly will stop committing to agricultural production and willingly start becoming carbon farmers. They are still quite high plateau prices, bearing in mind that the current ACCU price is about $17. So you're going to have about a 3 or 4-fold, well, easily 4-fold jump in that price over the next 1 or 2 decades in order for farmers at some stage to consider switching. So here are some papers. The second paper is one of the journals that we are sort of blacklisting because it's a paper that I submitted really because a colleague in the USA asked me to help him out and submit a paper because he was editing that particular journal issue. And some of the work I've presented comes from a bit of consultancy work I've completed for the CBH board. The CBH board were very interested in what might be the impacts on grain production in Western Australia of the twin impacts of climate change and a resurged interest in farmers either becoming carbon neutral over the next couple of decades or the influx of carbon investors keen to acquire farmland on which to plant trees, that is to supply carbon offsets for others. And you might be aware that the CBH as an entity invests annually hundreds of millions of dollars in very long-lived assets. And so they need to be mindful of what's strategically likely to occur in the agriculture of Western Australia to inform those sorts of investments. So that's a wrap. Tacklety, I'm open to any questions or comments.
Thanks, Ross. Very interesting presentation as usual. Very pleasing to follow what you are saying, and thanks for offering to give this seminar twice. The other one was also very interesting on Ukraine and prices. So there has been some communication on the chat line. I can't remember everything, but there were 2 important questions. One was why the 25 years was less costly. What do you do after 25 years versus 100 years? I think that's Dev. Steve also had a question about whose cost you were considering. I think that's also good. Is this just farm level cost that we are looking at? But let's start there. Dev, did you want to say something?
Okay, so Ross, I just noticed that the 25 years, 100 years issue was really critical in your analysis. But I wondered what you'd assumed to get that result, because I would have thought that to maintain the sequestration, you've got to keep, you've got to have a series of 25-year things. What's the difference between 4 lots of 25 and 1 lot of 100?
Yeah, so the difference there is that you're able, by your 4 lots of 25, you're actually on that same hectare, you are growing more carbon, because the biology, remember, is that the trees grow very quickly in those first few decades. So
But why? But I'm considering. I'm looking at the same piece of land.
Yep.
I'm not planting more trees. I'm saying you've got 100 hectares of land. You plant trees.
Yep.
You grow them for 25 years.
Yep. Then you can remove
if you don't have a new contract,
you can remove them
again. You can then remove them.
Yeah. You remove them, and then you begin again.
But what happens to the carbon that was stored in the first lot?
Well, and this is, I think, the fallacy for the federal government. They're still saying that's an ACCU, and like I dispute that, because really all you're doing is, it's not really a long-lived contribution. It's a very short-lived one of only 25 years. And I would have thought the most sensible thing to do is to have caveats like, if you remove those trees, they have to go either into a renewable energy source, like a biomass-based energy generation, or into timber.
But they've had a discount. They've got a discounted payment.
They have.
Because it's 25 years rather than 100.
Yeah.
But to my mind, the logical thing from there is to say, well, they've met their contractual obligations after 25 years. They can do what they like.
Yep.
And if we want them to maintain it, we need to pay them more for another 25 years.
Yes.
So then it's not so cheap.
That's true. That's what I thought they should do, but they don't. They just say 25 years.
Well, they're not thinking beyond 25 years at the moment, are they? It's beyond.
They're not.
That's 4 electoral cycles away, or 6 electoral cycles away. So
that's right.
Not of interest.
That's right. And I think, I don't know, I'd like to have these discussions, but I suspect that was introduced as an option for agro-political reasons.
Oh, totally. They just weren't getting any takers at 100 years. No one would sign up.
Just to reduce the barriers.
Yeah.
And increase the fallacies.
Yeah. That's right. So to me, it's almost a form of greenwashing.
Yeah, it is.
Totally. Because how about all the fossil fuel companies who purchased these ACUs to offset, and then the offsets aren't actually genuine, which just creates more emissions. Yeah.
So I agree with all those comments, but my analysis was just that if these are the rules of the game, then you can logically expect farmers and other investors to play by those rules.
Yeah, but I still think you could represent that differently, allowing for how farmers would behave.
Yes.
But trying to capture the real costs rather than just from a farmer's perspective.
True. Yeah, I could.
Okay, thanks. Who would like to go next? There is a lot in the chat,
Steve had a few questions.
Steve, are you online? Can you hear us?
Yes, I am. Well, probably the best is to, I don't know, there's a few, I don't see where my questions are anymore. There's been quite a few since then. Maybe you can see them and read them to Ross. One was about and someone just said that, so that already came up about, when we talk about cost of abatement, that was my first one. Is, well, which costs are we talking about? And cost to whom? Is it cost? The cost of farmers is part of the story. Cost to Australians is another part of the story, and then you have a cost to the government itself is still another story. That brought me to my second comment, was that it might be perhaps just as useful to consider the problem as, well, I think David actually did sort of hint at that. Start off with a cost to the country. We're looking at all the costs, right? Externalities included and long-term costs included, and then it becomes an allocation problem or a distribution problem. How much does the Australian public or the government, and well, the Australian public should be the case, want farmers to shoulder? What percentage do they want farmers to shoulder in the cost? Those ACCUs they're not determined really at this stage by anything that we can consider as a free market at all. So they're artificial. So the question really becomes, it's not so much the farm, as Ross, you said exactly, they're just responding to market signals and incentives. But the real question is not there. The real question is, one, what is the cost to the country of different options of land use? And secondly, given what the cost of each option is, what does I'll say the country, that's an abstraction, what does the country want farmers to shoulder? And of course, if they put too much onus on the farmers just won't do it. The really comes down to, what do Australians want to do with their land, and how do they value these different options? Am I making sense? That was one thing I had in mind anyway.
Yeah, they're useful comments, Steve. Certainly my analysis excluded externalities and therefore is an insufficient analysis. So the lens was really a very narrow lens. The issue of what does the nation want from its agricultural sector, that's an interesting question, and I think what the nation has wanted has changed over time. So initially, in the early history of Australia, they just wanted agriculture to, because remember, it was primarily a nation underpinned by agriculture, so they wanted to grow agriculture to provide economic growth and employment opportunities. As the economy has matured, then I think what is required of agriculture has altered, that agriculture is not so much seen as a required source of employment. It's still seen, I think, as a desired source of export revenue. However, it's also seen to needing to be a source of safe, affordable food and increasingly diverse foods. The challenge for a state like Western Australia is that most of the agricultural activity is underpinned by an export focus. In the case of wheat, about 95% of all the wheat we grow is exported. So if you then say to the farm sector, and remember, wheat is by far the dominant commodity that underpins farm businesses. If you say to farmers, you need to reduce emissions from your agricultural activity and give up some of your land to offset emissions that are occurring elsewhere in the economy, you end up raising the cost of producing a tonne of wheat, which then makes the export of that wheat less competitive on international markets. So in that sense, you do force on farmers a very real penalty. It's not like in some other sectors where, particularly on the domestic market, you are able to pass on costs through the supply chain while protecting some of your profit margin. That won't occur in an export-oriented sector like Western Australian agriculture. You can try and pass on those costs, but the end consumer in many situations is predominantly interested in the price of the good they acquire, not how it's produced. They're not paying for the production environment. However environmentally friendly that production environment is, and that's the international reality facing most export-oriented businesses in agriculture. So your question, Steve, is a very real one, and it will end up being felt in a very real way by farm families.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Just made me think of agricultural policy in general. Might apply less to Australia and New Zealand and so on, but if you look at agricultural policies, generally they tend to not go hard on farmers, usually, especially North American ones. So it's very difficult to imagine for me that government would try to impose the cost of carbon abatement on farmers. I think that's a big part of the politics, isn't it? Just my understanding of what's happening, is that something that the government would find difficult to do, right?
I think that's right. There's still a lot of urban empathy for farmers, and therefore there's a lot of sympathy for farmers, which makes it difficult to impose conditions on farmers. But the reality is that farmers are a very weak and waning political voice electorally, that the electoral strength is in urban communities, and the future of agriculture is going to be conditional on the views of urban communities and voters. And we've already seen that in recent decades with bans on clearing, with conditions regarding animal welfare. So the views of urban communities, whether farmers like it or not, are going to be imposed on the way in which they produce food. And yes, those impositions may occur gradually, but I think they will be an increasing feature of agricultural activity.
Okay, thanks, Russ.